The following report contains some disturbing images.
This is how the BBC website introduces a report by its BBC Panorama Syria correspondents Ian Pannell and Darren Conway on August the 30th, 2013. The story contained a video ostensibly shot near Aleppo, northern Syria, by an anonymous school headmaster and documenting the aftermath of a napalm attack on his school, supposedly perpetrated by the Syrian armed forces on August the 26th. According to the story, the evil forces of Bashar al-Assad, at a time when they had just about established their strategic advantage over the anti-government rebel forces and the foreign mercenaries they had been fighting for over 2 years, had found nothing better to do than attack a school, a target which presented no military interest whatsoever, with napalm no less, just so the international media, and BBC Panorama in particular, could pick the story and broadcast it to Western audiences in perfect timing to coincide with the British Parliament's vote on the so-called humanitarian intervention in Syria, which was being pushed for by Prime Minister David Cameron, ostensibly to prevent precisely this kind of atrocities.
The world shouldn't stand idly by.
Were Assad's forces really that stupid? Of course not. It did not take long before several international commentators and observers pointed out the many implausibilities in the video and the story in general. Among them, Italian author Francesco Santoianni showed how incongruent the whole story was, sparking the suspicion that the entire video might have been a fabrication. What follows is his analysis. First of all, napalm is a substance which generates temperatures between 800 and 1200 degrees Celsius. In other words, no one has ever survived direct exposure. These physical characteristics mean that when napalm was utilized in theaters of war, it was primarily used to defoliate areas covered with thick vegetation and not urban areas, where white phosphorus is more often used, as the United States Armed Forces did in Fallujah in 2005, and the Israeli Defense Forces did in Gaza in 2008. Nevertheless, the BBC expected its viewers to believe that Assad's forces had employed the obsolete napalm on a school. Of course, a school with no teaching resources inside, but somehow a swimming pool in the back. Oh, and a swing. Case closed. It must be a school. Although we are told by our sources in Syria that a school year did not start until September 15th, so what exactly were all those people doing in a locked-up school? In the video, we were also shown a pair of winter shoes, not clear how they ended up there. It was, after all, August. And a woman's shoe. Was all this footwear worn by the victims? How did it remain intact? Almost every British newspaper which reported the story informed us that the attack killed more than 10 pupils and left many more seriously injured. And yet, despite the warning against graphic images, we were not shown the bodies or the grieving parents. There is, to be sure, a child seen shaking in this scene. His skin is actually intact, and so is his hair, certainly not consistent with napalm or anything like it. And what is the white stuff on his body? Surely it cannot be the chemical fired from the fighter jets. That wouldn't have left his hair intact. Therefore we must assume that it's some kind of first aid ointment of sorts. Whoever administered it could not even be bothered to remove the watch from the kid's wrist. In fact, no one seems to be attending this child. The only person with some kind of interest is the cameraman. Somewhat less convincing is this couple, seen here going through the well-rehearsed motions of cursing in Arabic. There is a problem, though. The woman's face is covered with the same white stuff, and the couple has just arrived to the so-called hospital, so it cannot be some kind of first aid ointment. It must be the napalm-like chemical. We are expected to believe that a napalm-like chemical fired from a fighter jet somehow ended up sprayed on this woman's face, leaving her veil intact. Alright, this is supposed to be a makeshift hospital. On the floor, 5 adult males are shaking. 3 of them still have their clothes perfectly intact, of course, although keep an eye on this one, who simply stands up and walks off, having presumably decided that he's had enough. By the way, we keep seeing paramedics from the so-called charity Hand in Hand for Syria, supposedly handling chemical burn victims without any gloves on, but wearing masks for some reason, gas masks. And even a dust mask? What's that? The woman in question is, of course, Dr. Rola, the star of this video.
Among the medics here was a British doctor visiting for the charity Hand in Hand.
I need a pause because it's just absolute chaos and carnage here. We've had a massive influx of what looks like serious burns. It seems like it must be some sort of, I'm not really sure, maybe napalm, something similar to that.
Of course, the obligatory segment showing a distraught local venting his powerless rage at the international community, invariably denounced as inefficient and perennially locked in futile negotiations. The public relations rules dictate that such a character must be somehow connected with a tragedy, no details given, and that when he addresses the camera he must not speak in the local language, which would only sound like terrorist gibberish to most Western audiences. Rather, he has to produce an impromptu speech in an impeccable English, so impeccable to the point of sounding scripted and well rehearsed, or even read off a prompter. After all, these PR rules did work for Libya. Let's listen.
Dear United Nations, you're calling peace. You're calling for peace. What kind of peace are you calling for? Don't you see this? Don't you see this? What do you need to see? We are just human beings. We want to live, you know? Isn't it our right to live? Isn't it?
All these absurdities were exposed almost immediately after the release of the video on the BBC's channels. So why talk about them again now? Well, one reason is that the BBC itself, presumably after receiving dozens of complaints from viewers who didn't appreciate their intelligence being insulted, decided to salvage what little they could from the story and delete the biggest blooper of all. And this is where it gets creepy, because what follows leads one to believe that this was not the case of the BBC naively buying into a story packaged and sold to them by the anti-Assad PR machine. It wouldn't have been the first time. But rather that the BBC itself actively created a product that was intended to steer the public opinion towards a more interventionist position. For such a product, there can only be one definition: propaganda. What happened was that human rights activist Craig Murray, among others, realized that between the first and the second release of the video, something was different in the lines spoken by Dr. Rolla. Listen to the original one containing references to napalm.
I need a pause because it's just absolute chaos and carnage here. We've had a massive influx of what looks like serious burns. It seems like it must be some sort of, I'm not really sure, maybe napalm, something similar to that.
And now listen to the edited one.
It's just absolute chaos and carnage here. We've had a massive influx of what look like serious burns. It seems like it must be some sort of chemical weapon, I'm not really sure.
The reference to napalm has conveniently disappeared. Both audio clips have the same identical sound quality. Of course, there is very little that cannot be accomplished with the kind of technology that's available to the British Broadcasting Corporation, thanks in part to the fact that Dr. Rolla was wearing an exaggerated dust mask, which conveniently did away with all the challenges involved in dubbing, lip sync, etc. However, the redacted audio clip must have been added at a much later stage for reasons we have just explored, which prompts us to ask, how can we even be sure that the original audio clip was not scripted and recorded in a studio? Also, Robert Stewart, writing on the Media Lenses forum, points out that Dr. Saleha Hassan, featured in the new version of the video, is a filmmaker with a military background, a former captain in the Royal Army Medical Corps, and a freelance current affairs journalist. Was she involved in packaging this product? The background of Dr. Rolla herself is also interesting. Of course, she's no stranger to the BBC. Here she can be seen appearing on a political program advocating for the bombing of Syria.
I just feel that the world has failed Syria for the last 2.5 years, and now is the time to act.
Also of interest is the fact that the charity Hand in Hand for Syria, where Dr. Rolla supposedly works as a volunteer medic, happens to sport a flag of the French colonial era on its logo, a flag now adopted by the anti-Assad coalition. This is an affiliation which the BBC did not see fit to disclose to its viewers. For those who still believe in whatever is left of the BBC's reputation for upholding the mediatic standards of fair and balanced reporting, here is some useful information about another so-called charity. The BBC Media Action, formerly the BBC World Service Trust, with its catchy slogan, transforming lives through media around the world. In an interesting report available on its website, BBC Media Action explains, In 2008, BBC Media Action launched its 3-year project, Socially Responsible Media Platforms in the Arab World, with funding from the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Syrian News was the official Syrian partner endorsed by the Ministry of Information on behalf of the BBC. The project aimed to set up an interactive online training platform, the ARA2 Opinions Academy, for Syria's journalists and blogging communities, creating networks between the two. This reflected the changing status of bloggers in the regional media and responded to their aspiration to be seen as credible social commentators. The project also supported Syrian News as an example of a sustainable independent media organization, with managerial staff taking part in study tours in London and in business development training. BBC Media Action could not work with a local partner or blogger training, as this could have alienated and excluded parts of the blogging community. Instead, the BBC collaborated with an informal network of bloggers from across the country and recruited mentors for the distance learning system, the ARA2 Academy, who were trained at workshops in London and Damascus. One could not have wished for a clearer description of a Trojan horse funded by one government in order to destabilize another. Just to go over the timeline again, the 3-year BBC Action Syria project started in 2008. The Syrian uprising began in February 2011.